Hello, my name is Bradley Alicea. I'm from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory, and I'll be talking to you today about phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This is part of the work being done in the Representational Brains and Phenotypes interest group, as well as the Computational Developmental Systems interest group. So this continues a long arc of work we've been doing in the area of computational agents and achieving that via EcoDevo. So EcoDevo is evolution, development, and this in silico component. So when we talk about evolution, we're taking a phylogenetic approach to cognition, and this is going to be summarized as embodied cognition through shared derived traits. The developmental aspect involves morphogenesis and acquisition through critical periods. And then the in silico EcoDevo part will involve continual learning, intergenerational inheritance of innate and cultural acquisitions. When we talk about phylogenetics, we're talking about a tree, and more specifically a tree that summarizes the morphological aspects of embodied agents, as well as the behaviors of embodied agents. So we see here that this is a phylogenetic analysis of Breitenberg vehicles as proposed by Breitenberg in his book on Breitenberg vehicles. So we have things classified here in terms of their behaviors and in terms of their morphology. So you have forward Brownian, a vehicle that produces forward Brownian motion as sort of the outgroup, and then you have crosstalk, which evolves multiple times. You have other vehicles that are grouped together in clades, such as vehicles 2 and vehicles 3. Vehicles A and B, vehicles 3A and 3B are in a subclade, and vehicles 2A and 2C are in a subclade. So when we talk about shared derived traits, we're talking about the concept of homology. And this is a phylogenetic tree that shows homology in a number of different vehicle morphologies that evolve from a common developmental precursor. And so when we talk about shared derived traits, we're talking about homology, which are similar traits related through common ancestry. When we talk about independently derived traits, we're talking about convergent evolution. So we have two examples of convergent evolution here, taking different evolutionary pathways, but yielding us basically similar or the same traits. So convergent evolution are similar features that are not derived from a common ancestor and have multiple origins. Back in the Breitenberg vehicles phylogenetic analysis, crosstalk would be an example of convergent evolution. Finally, we have developmental origins of traits. So we take that evolutionary tree and we think about it explicitly in terms of its development. And we think about then how development proceeds to different layered precursors. So on one side we have the tripoblastic or three-layered precursor. On the other side we have dipoblastic or the two-layered precursor. And this recapitulates what we see in nature. The tripoblastic case gives us the roller, and the dipoblastic case gives us the swimmer. And we can see that then this yields a number of viable phenotypes, and we can classify those. Part of our developmental approach is to evolve embodied agent phenotypes using a series of morphological and behavioral acquisitions. These need to be sequenced in the right order, as well as occur during these critical periods. So there are windows of time in which morphological acquisitions need to happen, windows of time in which behavioral acquisitions need to happen, and the sequencing needs to be right for them to be quote-unquote viable. And we can see here that we have this developmental process on the right where we start with a midline in an undifferentiated agent. We then get the evolution of chemoattraction or the development of chemoattraction, and then that's acquired. And then we have a central nervous system that's acquired at the end. So we have our morphological acquisition, our behavioral acquisition, and a second morphological acquisition that gives us the full agent. So this is an example of forward movement as a behavioral acquisition. We have this precursor morphogenetic acquisition, which is this extrusion event that yields the components of the sensors and effectors. Then we have the actual behavioral acquisition of forward movement. And then on the right, we have this two-step sensor effector differentiation. In this case, morphogenetic acquisition enables behavioral acquisition. Behavior enables embodiment. And this also summarizes another case where we have three morphogenetic acquisitions that enable embodiment but don't enable complex behaviors. So in this case, we start with a triblastic precursor we end up with these different movements that occur that are all morphogenetic. We can characterize the evolution of development as the acquisitions of these different traits. In red, we have two morphogenetic acquisitions, the primary body plan and the secondary body plan. We can also turn to 4E, or embodiment, enactive, embedded, and extended cognition. And we can characterize developing systems in this way. So we can look at the intersection between cognition and developmental morphogenesis. We can also add another E, which is evolution. And if you want to know more about that, we have a publication in Royal Society Interface Focus. To put this into context, we have to talk about the difference between cybernetic cognition and phylogenetic cognition. So here are some publications I'm going to draw from the Figdor publication. CISAC, also useful, as well as the Levin and Dennett comment in ANSAs. So the cybernetic view of cognition, and this is defined by Figdor in a couple of ways. There's the functionalist explanation, which is information processing by feedback control systems. When she talks about information processing, this means some sort of input-output process guided by goals and executed by autonomous agents. The important part here is it's not substrate specific, so it doesn't depend on a specific phenotype or morphology. This is consistent with Norbert Wiener's view of information processing as being guided by goals and executed by autonomous agents. Again, there's this medium independence. Cognition does not rely upon a specific substrate configuration, so there's this phylogenetic independence. The phylogenetic view of cognition, however, is more structural functionalist. And this is where you have this information processing by feedback control systems, but there isn't this sort of general cybernetic model. You have to evolve the components in pieces, and they can be highly specialized for different types of cognition. So different types of cognitive traits form. You get different types of cognition in mammals, insects, and even single cells. And those are specific collections of traits deriving from a common ancestor. So these are an example of classical Bradenburg vehicles. Again, we have this first order stimulus response mapping. The Bradenburg vehicles approach is very much the cybernetic approach, where we have very simple neural networks that are embodied agents, but the effects of the embody are explicit. So we have this cybernetic view, but we also have the suggestion that phylogeny may have to play a role ultimately in developing this Bradenburg vehicle approach. So again, we have the phylogeny of morphology, and we have the phylogeny of behavior combining, and then the question is, are Bradenburg vehicles substrate independent? We know that we have different circuitries for the different vehicle types, so the assumption is that they're substrate independent, but the argument here is maybe that they're not. We have these genomic representations, which we use in our developmental models. We have genes that encode different traits, and there are these canalization switches which allow us to move through the genome and decode parts of that representation to form these developmental agents. We also have different types of features, canalization switches, that enable morphological acquisitions, and then behavioral acquisitions are enabled by a combination of the genotype and the environment. And we can do our calculations on this so that we can see how they might change over time. We have mutation, we have other types of operators that we can use to shift developmental timing to change when these morphological acquisitions occur. Finally, we have this dual inheritance model. So part of the way that behavioral acquisitions occur is that they occur both in concert with the genome and independently of the genome. And we're using Boyd and Richardson's model of a dual process or dual inheritance model. So there's cultural inheritance and there's genetic inheritance. And so in that way, evolution can be both teleonomic, which is behavioral, and non-teleonomic, which involves the phenotype and the genome, and they proceed under different conditions. So you get these envelopes that are semi-orthogonal that give the agent different capacities for change. Again, we can have a population of agents summarized both in terms of their genotype and ultimately their phenotype and their behavioral milieu. And again, we can characterize this phylogenetically. So we have in cases in which morphology and behavior more or less overlap, in other cases where they're divergent. Thank you for your attention.